Today is the last of a three-part series, and today we're going to focus on three paintings where artists are focusing on family pictures and their representation. We're going to look at the first painter, Mary Cassatt, and she lived during the period of 1844 to 1926. And what's important about Mary is that she was an Impressionist painter. During the 1800s, I like to talk a little bit about what is happening in the world or in the life of that artist in their environment, because it definitely affects the kind of art that they do in their style. During the late 1800s, 1850 to 1900, women cared for the house, the husband, and children. They learned music, sewing, and painting, but they were really not professional women per se. In 1872, Montgomery Ward and Sears started the first mail order catalog, so we went from handmade clothes to ready-made clothes. Education was starting, and an emphasis on college for women and K through 12 for children. Many immigrants were coming into the country at the time, and they wanted their children educated. Vaccines were discovered, so people were living longer. As I mentioned, women did not pursue a career outside the home by and large, unless it were for areas like nursing and teaching. Now, Mary Cassatt was different. She was an outspoken, opinionated young woman at 17 who wanted to go to school. She wanted to become an artist. She lived during the time when Seneca Falls in upstate New York had its first women's rights convention, and the women's rights movement started and was well underway, so that by 1919 we had the 19th Amendment. That was a period of time, 1900, like the year 2000, was a pivotal time for society, inventions, technology, the environment. It was a change. A door opened and we went through a different period. In the 1900s, widgets, the photography started, manufacturing, movement from agrarian to urban. It was a time of flux. Mary, as I mentioned, was born in 1844 in Pittsburgh. Her father was a wealthy investor. Her mother was educated. Books, art, and French language, and she wanted her children to understand and know the world. And about 1860, when Mary was 17, she started art classes at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts against her father's wishes. The family was wealthy. They spent several years in France, where Mary continued her education, and her goal was really to transform the way women were depicted at the time. So if you were to do a Google search on painters who painted women and children, Mary Cassatt's name would come up. That was her subject throughout her life. She presented women and children as intellectual beings rather than something objectified, a spectacle. She created paintings of women in their social and private lives, kind of emphasizing the bond between the woman and child. And then we can go to the painting we're going to talk about, which is called the Caress. And so when we take a look at this, Mary Cassatt was 58 years old when she painted this painting in 1902. And the first thing we like to do is we like to just kind of say, where are our eyes drawn as we take a look at this painting? As you think about it, many artists, and Paris was a mecca for artists in the year 1900, many artists made their living in the Louvre painting copies, which the Louvre sold. So artists had this, this education that was based in the classics. And you can see that in this painting, can't you? It's very classical in its presentation, along with this impressionistic feeling that you have when you look at it, but when you look at the painting, where are your eyes drawn?
For me, it's the faces.
The faces. Is there any one face?
Mother.
Yeah.
To the baby's eyes.
Baby's eyes, the mother.
I'm drawn to the baby's abdomen.
Yeah, me too.
Wow.
Me too. But I think if I'm looking at the faces, it's the mother's face that I look at first.
All right.
The baby's belly is kind of what's
So
first.
Mary Cassatt painted so that your focus was on the people. The background was devoid of any kind of details that would compete with the individuals. The artist, Mary's guiding you through the painting, and there are suggestive lines and colors and clusters. So one of the classic lines would be the triangle. There are several triangles in this painting that guide you through it. Can you see it?
Yes.
What do you see as one triangle?
Her elbow.
Elbow?
Both the elbows, the little girls and the moms.
And the moms.
She
And
was
there's
in the middle.
There's a
I
very
think the mother's hairline and her hair, the way it points up into a V.
Yep, that's another one. There's an overriding one in the picture that goes from the top of the mother's hair to the bottom of her green elbow, to the elbow of the little girl, back to the top of the woman's head. And then there's a smaller triangle within the larger one that keeps you in the photo, in the painting. The top of the little girl's head to the top of the little boy's head, to the bottom of the little boy's finger, back to the top of the little girl's head, and over to the little boy's head. So you are kept in the photo with that eye line down to the fingers, back up to the top of her head, over to the little boys, the color's the same, down to the hand. So Mary Cassatt is using classical techniques in composition to keep you into the painting. So let's take a look at some other things. Let's talk a little bit about the color. What colors does she use?
Muted colors.
Very muted colors. Now, Impressionist paintings, that green usually would just kind of dissolve and mix into the background, and there wouldn't be any kind of hard delineation between the line necessarily. So she's refraining from using any really hard lines, but she's also refraining from having the paint dissolve itself, as many Impressionistic paintings do. And instead, the light kind of enhances the color. She paints with a quick brushstroke and has always used, for the most part, a pastel palette. What emotions, when you look at this, and let's just talk about the extremes of emotions, from exuberance and anxiety to something really passive, and there's this range of emotions in the middle. What would you feel when you look at the painting? What message do you think she's giving us?
The love of the little boy.
Love of the little boy. Is it calm or is it exciting?
Very calm.
Very calm. And do we all have mothers? We do. She's really playing on this sensitivity that we can relate to this image. She earned her money working in the Louvre. Women did, with low-paid salaries, painting copies for sale by the museum. In Paris, women had to be chaperoned on the streets. They were not allowed in the great salons to exhibit their art. They were not allowed in cafes. So men really had the upper hand as artists during the Impressionistic period. Degas and Mary Cassatt met one another, and he often would look at her paintings and actually move the lines around and create adjustments in her paintings for herself. She did later on exhibit one of her paintings in a salon, which was well regarded, and it put her on track as an artist of the time. It was in 1960 or 1868 that she was accepted in a Paris salon. In the 1890s, while she was well into her older years, was the most creative period for her. She became much more self-disciplined, much more intense and less outspoken, and perhaps it was her outspokenness that prohibited her from entering the great artists of the time, along with being a woman, frankly. Her recognition of her art came slowly in the United States. Even her family, from her family, she received little recognition because she was an advocate for women's rights, and it split her family in half. She donated most of her art instead of kind of bequeathing it to her family because of that. But she is regarded today as one of the classical women painters of all time because of her images of this tenderness that she portrayed and captured between a mother and her children. She never married and she never had children. So it's worth it when we're finished to do a Google search on Mary Cassatt to see the images of mother and children that she painted and the similarity, her style, her messaging is clear throughout her kind of litany and portfolio of paintings that she's done. Any thoughts about her before we leave? This painting's about 32 inches by 27 inches. And art critics usually assign emotives for painters, and this one is emotion and love. That's what is associated with Mary Cassatt.
Kathy, when you say they, since you worked in the Louvre and made her money that way, would you say that she was drawing maybe some inspiration from, Madonna and child portraits, like a Pietà?
I would say definitely, because she spent time also in Italy. The Archbishop of Pennsylvania commissioned her to do 2 paintings, and that part of that commission was travel to Italy to work. So she was definitely influenced by the Madonna and Child and the voluptuous paintings of women of that era, the skin tones. When you take a look at how close she was really to she died in 1926, so that would be just before abstract expressionism hit, before, and Matisse and Duran, whom we studied, was doing this vibrant wash with colors, sticks of dynamite they called them, and here she was still painting this very classical pose using very classical reflections of women and children. So yes, I would say definitely influenced by the great masters who painted the Madonna and Child. But a contemporary look, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Okay. So,
I have noticed, and I can't seem to take my eyes away from the mother's face, and she looks somewhat impassive. And from what you said, that Mary Cassatt did not have, had never married and had no children, it seems that she's somewhat distancing herself from the 2 children. I don't know. That's the impression I'm getting.
I wondered why Mary Cassatt painted her looking out of the picture.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered. I haven't read anything from any art critic, an analysis of this, nor anything that Mary Cassatt has, any quote from her, but I agree. It is almost a dispassionate look.
Yes.
but it's countered by this very loving embrace between these two children and Mary holding the hand of that child.
Confusing.
Yes, I think it's a good point.
Yeah.
Good. She was greatly loved by her mother, by the way, and her mother supported her art and encouraged this child to become the best she could be with all of her children. So we move on now to Henri Matisse, who painted his wife. And Henri Matisse, The Woman with a Hat, was painted in 1905. He was regarded as really bringing the modern art movement into Paris. He was born in northern France to a wealthy grain merchant. His father made him study law, and he started to paint when he was about 20. He was recovering from an appendicitis attack, and his mother bought him art supplies. And he felt such affinity for the expression through art that he dropped law, much to his father's disagreement. So he started in his early 20s, at about 20, working with art. Now, Matisse's life spans 80 years, and he started painting when he was 20. And I feel like I'm doing such a disservice to this man and even talking to him, because each one of the decades of his life was filled with such accomplishment and such a contribution to art that his affiliations with certain people moved art forward so tremendously. He copied the great artists in the Louvre, like many other women and men artists did at the time. It was a way to make money if you were an artist. He was often regarded throughout his life as the most important French painter in the 20th century, in the 1900s. He was a leader of Fauvism, and we studied Fauvism. We looked at Andre Deraun's picture of the London Bridge. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Vibrant colors, made no sense, a splash here, a splash there. They regarded colors as sticks of dynamite, and you followed them wherever they took you. So he and Andre Deraun, and it was Matisse who met Vincent van Gogh and looked at his paintings. So Matisse's paintings changed after this preview of Vincent van Gogh's work. Prior to that time, he too was copying the masters. He was a very contemporary artist for the time, a realist, but there was an anxiety in him to express his own feeling and his own style. And Vincent van Gogh was a catalyst for him. And to do that, and we're looking at a painting, and it's I'm hoping that your collaboration, your color collaboration on your screen is better than mine, because those colors are vibrant, and I have pastel colors. So if you have pastel colors, our collaboration is off, calibration is off. They should be very bright, vibrant. He drew from nature. He was a contemporary of Picasso. Picasso drew from his imagination. They both painted women in still life. They both made extraordinary impressions on the art world at the time. He said that painting was a reflection of the time in which the artist lived. So this painting was painted in 1905. Matisse was 36 years old at the time he painted it. It's his wife. His wife was a milliner. She made hats. The painting, when it was released to the public, was jarring, and it put his fellow moderners' teeth on edge. They looked at this and they simply could not understand it. It was an affront to the sense that you were an accomplished artist and could create reality on your canvas. Sections of the academic world called it not art, but a dangerous and infectious disease. believe it or not, a seemingly random color, forcing the viewer to kind of create reality out of his impression. So that's kind of the background for it and the inspiration for this piece of art. Let's talk about where our eyes are drawn. Where do you think Matisse wanted you to look when you looked at this painting?
I see her eyes.
I agree.
Yes. Can I ask you, is the color on your screen vibrant or pastel?
It's pretty vibrant on mine.
Mine's
And
vibrant.
mine
it?
is pretty pastel.
Mine too. So, and I ask that because he expected us to notice the color. He expected it. And I think the eyes are the correct, according to many art critics, the eyes are really what should draw us, but there's another point that draws us. And it's in many ways what the picture hangs on, and it's the yellow dab on her nose.
Okay.
Interesting. Oh,
And for those of us who have pastel, I would say, well, but it's quite vibrant on your screen, I'm sure. So it is the eyes, but let's take a look at how the artist guided, how Matisse guided us through this painting. Let's look at our color and our triangles and circles and suggestive lines. So first of all, standing back from it, is there an overall shape to Amelia? From the hat to the bottom.
I think so. I think you could make an argument for a triangle from the top of the hat to the bottom of the picture.
that's Ken.
You
And
could,
It's
again,
not.
I think, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Again, I see more than one triangle because I see the nose as the apex of another triangle.
right, right. And her face is one.
Mhm.
Mhm.
It's the green color that
The
starts.
elbow and the,
Now, first let's just work with her from the top of her head to the bottom. So Amelia was a milliner. She created and made hats. She is dressed in black. She has a gloved arm holding that white fan.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know she was holding a fan.
Me
You see
too.
the fan?
yeah, I missed that, yeah.
I can see it
Oh,
now.
I see it now. I see it. Okay.
And she is rather short-waisted because that orange band is her waist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's take a look at what we see inside this picture. Her hat and face together do form the triangle. And the face triangle upsweeps and leads us up to that hat. And that fan, now that you know what it is, also forms somewhat of a triangle. But I want you to take a look at the top of her hat, come down around both sides, sweep into the center around her neck, and sweep out around her shoulder at the edge of the fan and around. And what is that? You tip it upside down and the sand comes from one side to the
Like
other.
an hourglass.
An hourglass. You see that?
Yeah.
No, fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Orange for the neck. An orange for the band. Nowhere at the time would a painter swatch that green across her forehead and down her nose.
Right.
Your impression when you look, do you like this painting? Let me ask you that. Do you like it?
I do.
I
And
I
love
do
the
too
colors.
as well.
Yeah, I love the colors.
The colors are beautiful, aren't they?
Yes.
It looks like she has a cane in her hand.
That's what I thought.
I do too.
With the
Yeah.
cane.
With her glove.
It might be a cane, or it might be just simply a chair, or it might
Yeah.
be nothing. Mhm.
Yeah.
The painting is sewn together by repeated colors. See that?
Mhm.
Amelia's career ups and downs. She went out of business for a while, and also Matisse, in and out of his life as a painter, was poor. So it's said that this is a personal painting to Amelia. It's a portrait of his wife, and very personal as they were going through their life together. She would support him and he would support her. There's a very famous art historian named T.J. Clark. He was influential in developing the whole field of art history. And he says that because of the presence of the huge hat in the portrait, the painting is much more personal than just what meets the eye. That it is a reflection of his love for his wife, as well as this symbol that of her work and what she's done. His mastery of color and drawing over half a century really made him a leading figure in modern art. You can see during this period was his period of what's called Fauvism, where colors were just very wild. It was a departure from Impressionism, and he and the painter Derain used these very, very bright, vigorous colors. That period lasted only about 5 years. It almost was unsustainable. I don't think that many artists could really deliver. And it moved into Cubism and kind of splintered into abstract expressionism after a time where shapes started to take place. One of the most interesting things about Matisse is that at the end of his life, and he lived 84 years, he had a indigestion stomach problem, and through surgery was unable to move. He lived in a wheelchair and was bedridden at the end of his life. He did have assistants and caretakers with him, but he stopped painting towards the end of his life and reverted back to cut paper. And if you know anything about Matisse, you'll know that he has a whole repertoire of work that is done in paper collage. He did stained glass windows this way. When we do children's classes, one of the ways we teach Matisse is through his paper collage. Now, what was interesting is that from the very early beginning of Matisse's career, before he would create his painting, he would cut paper and create the image on a board or on a table. You can imagine Matisse taking colored paper and creating the woman with a hat with bits of paper to determine how he would create the composition, where his color might be. And at the end of his life, he would instruct his assistants. He would use his scissors as a paintbrush to paste the images on a wall for him. And he did produce art through the end of his life with cut paper this way. But he did it throughout his whole life, as it turned out, to create his paintings. His 84 years are full. You would need a whole course to understand how he became the artist he did and what his training was like and how he moved through the different periods of art in Paris, bold, defying convention, being impressed by other artists. He was a great collector of his contemporary friends' art. Again, do a search on Matisse and click the images and just run your eyes for your art education lesson over the various paintings and cut paper collages that Matisse did. So, any thoughts about Matisse before we leave The Woman with a Hat?
Yes, I have a question. I don't know why, for whatever reason, I seem to keep checking out the eyes of the models, and she looks like she has very sad eyes.
Yes.
And it seems to, it's bothering me for some reason, because the painting is so beautiful and so, to me, warm, but her eyes aren't, and I'm wondering.
I'm wondering too. I don't know. I've not read any curator or art historian or art critic's interpretation of the woman with the hat and the eyes, and why they are so beseeching, why they have so much expression. When you take a look at the color in this painting and then you zero in on the eyes, it's a contrast,
Yes.
isn't it?
She's not smiling. I mean, she looks a little bit sad. That was going to be my comment, that she's not smiling. She's not really happy in this portrait. But there is something very compelling about her look. It's hard to explain what she's feeling, but she inspires some feeling in me, but not a happy feeling necessarily.
I know, I agree. They struggled financially. She had this business and it failed as a hat maker. It just failed. And while it was doing well, she supported both of them. And then he would sell a little bit and he would support both of them. But it was difficult for artists to live at that time. And I think maybe that's what it's a testimony to his wife. We know that. And as this great historian says, the painting is very personal for Matisse. And that must be it. Any other thoughts? It's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
Despite the sad eyes, it would make you happy to have all that color in your life.
Absolutely. And that's what I keep thinking, is that there is kind of a confusion, because the colors make me feel good. The subject matter makes me feel good until I look at her eyes, and she looks very sad. And so it has mixed emotions.
It has mixed emotions.
Yeah, I agree. I think she does look sad, and the eyebrows are very dominant with her eyes. And I think the size of that hat is probably symbolic. It could be symbolic of, her importance in maybe the family earning money. Yeah, I don't know.
It could be. And remember, this is a black dress. This is a black hat. And this is the color. There was no color in front of him. None.
The hat I'm seeing is not black. I don't.
Yeah, it looks blue on my vision.
Yeah, blues and orange and all different colors.
Right. It isn't that.
And purple.
Right. But the original, when she was sitting there posing, the dress was black that she was wearing. The hat was black that she was wearing, as well as the gloves. We know that part. And his impression delivered all this color.
Yes.
All together.
You mentioned that he was in a wheelchair, disabled. Would he have been disabled during the period he drew this?
No, he was 36 years old when he did this, and he died at 84 years old in 1954. So the last 10 years of his life after the surgery were as an invalid. So he was really in his prime, because this would be the Fauves period. This would be the post-impressionist period, when the artist said, I will control my own color. I will do what I want. The color became just very vivid, and strokes became short and swift, and the canvas wasn't filled necessarily. There were blank spots in it, almost as though it was an unfinished canvas. So he was making a statement here, because it was rejected by his contemporaries as being I think the words were putting their teeth on edge. It was a shock. So this is our Matisse, and we will bid adieu, and please go out and take a look at some of the work that he has done. And now we come to Norman Rockwell, and the series that we're doing today is really chronological. Mary Cassatt was born in the mid-1800s, 1844, and lived to 1926. And Henri Matisse was born also in the 1860s and lived to 1954. And now we move to Norman Rockwell, who was born at the end of the 1800s, 1894, and lived to 1978, 1894 to 1978. And I chose him because he is probably one of the most underappreciated and misunderstood American artists. What is the relationship to the period when he grew up? He grew up in New York City. He started to paint in the 40s and 50s, and it was a sorrowful time for the people in the United States. We had just finished the Depression. 2 world wars had just finished. Numerous women had lost their sons and husbands, mothers, their sons. It was a time when the people of this country wanted some sense of normalcy. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah.
Yeah. Feels like today.
Can we have something normal? So when Rockwell started to paint, not what America was, but what he thought it could be or what his vision was, through the Saturday Evening Post images, of which there were 323 covers, he became loved. He was beloved. It was heartwarming. He started out painting for Boy's Life when he was about in his late teens. He actually started painting when he was about 6 or 7 years old. He was drawing. Maybe he was a great draftsperson. His experience in life, and we'll get to it towards the end, really spanned 2 periods. The nostalgic period I talked about, and then he became a symbol for 20th century American racial progress. So we have to look at a second painting to understand what that means. Again, art critics were very hard on him. Very hard on him, despite this painting that we're going to look at sold for $46 million in Sotheby's in 2013. That was an enormous amount of money.
Wow.
Liz.
He, like all of us, had a few short suits, and we weren't always happy. He was depressive. He was plagued by constant anxiety. He had years of therapy, as his wife did. He painted for 47 years with the Saturday Evening Post, and then left them because he started to move towards social commentary, civil rights and poverty and space exploration. And the Saturday Evening Post wanted the nostalgia. So Rockwell moved to Life magazine, where he could do the second stage of his life and paint his interests of civil rights, poverty, and space exploration. The inspiration for this painting, Saying Grace, in 1951, he was 57 years old when he painted it. It came from a reader of the Saturday Evening Post who observed a Mennonite family praying in a restaurant. And oftentimes Norman Rockwell would receive letters and be inspired by some of the observations that readers would write to him, and this was one of them. He refused to paint necessarily only from the imagination. He created a kind of a cinematic background for himself. In this instance, the chairs came from a restaurant. He brought props in. He wouldn't paint an old wool sock without having it in front of him. People would pose. They would sit for hours as he would paint them in positions. So undoubtedly this woman sat there in his studio looking like this. And then his son is one of the images to the right or to the left, sat in a pose as Norman Rockwell painted. So he was very explicit and a perfectionist in his painting. He painted really a small town utopia image in his mind, as I said, that everybody has a responsibility to everybody else. And that's a theme that runs through his paintings. His pictures were about family, friendships, and community. And frankly, with 323 original covers, he had a knack for a direct hit on his audience. They loved it. So we're going to take a look at this painting called Saying Grace that was painted in 1951 when he was 57 years old. So I'm going to ask the same question. When you look at this painting, where do your eyes go? There's a focal point.
The woman's face. For me.
Or maybe the top of that triangle formed by the woman and the little boy.
Anybody else?
Yes, and mine go to the blonde man, the young man.
Mm-hmm.
And then the mother, yeah.
It's the nape of the child's neck, so the critics say.
Okay.
Because Rockwell knew and understood a parent's love for that part of their child's body for some reason. So let's just take a look at a little bit, let's kind of analyze this picture a little bit and take a look at what we're seeing. And Priscilla, I want to ask you, is this the picture that I sent you just recently?
You know what? It's one I put the title in online, so it might not be the exact same one.
And the reason I say that is because this gentleman who you see in the lower left corner
Yeah.
is sitting at a table where the knife and fork are pointing to the woman and the boy.
You're right. Let me see. Look at this one for a second. Let me see if I can find that other version.
Okay, while she's looking at that version, let's take a look at what might be going on in this painting.
I find it very, very confusing also, because obviously the lady and the little boy are very devout. They're saying grace, and yet the two young men, one has a cigarette dangling from his mouth, are just kind of looking at the other two, I don't know, with disdain, I guess. I'm not sure, but it's kind of, again, it's another painting that's confusing for me.
Mm-hmm. And Rockwell's intent was that here's an old-fashioned woman and a young boy deep in their faith, saying grace at a table, and the two gentlemen looking at them, the two young boys. It's not so much if he wanted it to be a feeling of disdain as it was when he talked about it earlier, that everybody has a responsibility to everybody else and that they are just simply quiet, watching, observing, and being respectful.
Mm-hmm.
So
his
impression was just the opposite. Now, when we take a look at this photo or this painting, and when Priscilla can bring the other one up, Norman Rockwell was an incredible draftsperson, and he had this ability to create a story and tell a story in his paintings.
Oh.
There we go.
Oh.
There we go. That's the other one. So it is the back of the boy's neck. And let me just share a few observations. And as I talk, watch what's happening in this picture. It's a complex composition that Rockwell created with photos and sketches and live models and props in his own imagination. And he used something created at that time called deep focus. And it was done in cinemas, in movies, in which the foreground The middle ground and the background are all in clarity. They're all in focus. In a painting, usually to create depth or perspective, whatever's in the background becomes very blurry. And in this case, it's what's called deep focus. It's a complex story in a very single, compelling image of ordinary lives. And that's what he wanted us to see. Why has the woman and the son wandered in, or a grandson wandered into this restaurant? Where are they going? Where are they coming from? It almost wants us to ask more. So the focus of the painting is on the boy, kind of a symbol of innocence and purity of childhood. The boy is the only one with a jacket off, and the white shirt kind of draws us, the viewer, draws us into the painting. Her white scarf ties the two together as the boy leans into her. And the woman is obviously from a bygone era. Their clothing is somewhat out of date when you take a look at the others. In the foreground, the light bounces off that man's fork and knife, pointing us back to the woman and the grandson. And the stairs are pointing us to those two people. The man on the left standing up and the man on the right are kind of pillars for the painting.
Oh, okay.
That on the left is pointing us in. And now that you see this particular painting image, the gentleman who's sitting with a cigar in the foreground, his eyes are our avenue into that painting.
Yeah.
Norman Rockwell is using these vibrant red highlights strategically placed throughout the scene to direct our eyes around the composition. Do you see them? The red?
Mm-hmm.
It's really all the bright colors we see. Look at them. Unconsciously, we see them in the bag. The bit to the right, there's a little bit of red in the hat of it that the umbrella is stuck in, under the woman's seat, in her hat, under the little boy's chair.
Also the vinegar.
Mm-hmm. Despite the fact that the gentleman standing up on the left, the quarter image of the man on the lower left, and just the arm on the right of the person standing on the right, there are 9 figures in this painting, but they are all part of the composition, even though we see parts of their body. By seeing only parts of our body, what an artist is doing is saying there's more to the painting, giving us this feeling that it goes on and on. There's another technique that's being used by Norman Rockwell to take us into this picture. And it's that the low perspective creates the sense that you're sitting in the diner and participating in the action. You're not looking down. You're not standing outside the picture. You're actually sitting at that table looking in.
Mm-hmm.
It's a complex kind of narrative in this single image. We studied one other artist, Edward Hopper, who painted the scene of the gas station that was able to create such a compelling story the same way that Norman Rockwell did about the same time. The great collectors of the Norman Rockwell were George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, the cinema producers. I think Steven Spielberg has about 50 paintings and George Lucas has about 30 paintings that they pulled together one time or contributed to an exhibition of Norman Rockwell's work. And Steven Spielberg was asked why he collected the Norman Rockwells. And he said that he was always on my mind when I worked because I had a great deal of respect for how he could tell stories in a single frozen image, the entire story. Rockwell said, the view of life I communicate in my pictures excludes the sordid and ugly. I paint life as I would like it to be. Isn't that interesting? On all those covers, if you recall all of them, he referred to his pictures or his work as pictures, like a movie director, creating illustrations and paintings. He did an exhaustive amount of research to create the images. So many photographs would come together. He did pencil sketches, he cast models, and he would hire costumes and props, and then coax people into different models. People would look at this painting and say, I've been in that restaurant, even though it doesn't exist. He was so critical of his story that he wanted to share. By the time he was finished painting the nostalgic paintings of the Saturday Evening Post, people would write to him and ask for these sweet old pictures that he used to do. But he would say, you can't make the good old days come back just by painting pictures of them. This kind of stuff is dead, he said, and I think it's about time. Isn't that an interesting thing to say? And perhaps he was feeling what the critics said, that it was just a squeaky clean view of America that didn't exist. Kind of artificial. Yet people loved it. What are your thoughts about it?
I'm wondering, you had said earlier that critically he was not very famous, not very well respected. And I'm wondering, is it because he did magazine covers that the so-called critics thought he was not really for real, a real artist?
I think the sound was difficult for me. I think I heard you, but I'm not sure.
I can repeat it. You
Please.
had said earlier that he was not very well respected by the critics of his age.
No.
And so I'm wondering, was that because he did magazine covers and they felt he was not really a real artist?
I don't think it was because he did magazine covers, as I've read. It was by and large the time he painted. He painted in the 50s, and the dominant art movement at that time was abstract expressionism. It was Kandinsky who painted squares. It was the Campbell soup can. It was images of toilets, if you remember. So the mood in art at that time was very abstract. The beatniks were out, when beat poetry was out and bebop was out. He was perpendicular to the time of art, to the tenor of art. And because his time painting these images was so long, it was 47 years that he painted these covers, 323 covers. So he spanned 4 decades, almost 5 decades of painting nostalgia, America as people would love it to be in their dreams, safe. But it was a time when art was going in a different direction. And just like there's always a counterpoint to a point taking place in society, that was the counterpoint. So it wasn't so much that he was painting for a magazine as it was his subject matter was regarded as soft and mushy, kind of.
I guess that's why we have to ignore all critics, because they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah. He was greatly beloved by the public. And it is only now, really, that, as it is with most artists who pass away, that there's an appreciation for the work that they did. And Norman Rockwell is highly regarded for his delivery of technical illustration. This is superb from a technical illustration point of view, and it's from his years of work with, he also spent almost an entire lifetime drawing covers for Boys Life, for Boy Scouts of America.
Mhm.
So he was an illustrator, applying paint to the illustrations, and very believable, very realistic at a time when realism was not appreciated. And before we go on, now there's another part of Norman Rockwell. In the mid-1960s, he was asked to do a portrait of Richard Nixon and J.F. Kennedy and LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was asked to do their portraits. And we'll have to read a little bit more. I'm going to just graze over this so that I don't misinform you, but my impression was he was struck negatively by the eyes of Nixon and positively by the eyes of JFK, of Kennedy. He changed in the mid-60s away from nostalgia to embracing the ills of society. One can only guess that at some point he painted perfection in America to the point where he just simply couldn't believe it anymore. And it became real for him, the poverty, space exploration, and more importantly, civil rights. The world is one country and mankind its citizen. So he left the Saturday Evening Post and he moved to Life magazine, where he could create these images that was in his heart about the world that we lived in. This painting is called The Problem We All Live With. It is really the most famous painting of the civil rights movement. This is little Ruby Bridges, as she is walked by 4 federal officers to her Louisiana elementary school. He had fellow officers in his studio pose like this, and the reason they're foreshortened is really to take you off the picture and give the impression that there's far more going on here than there is. The little girl was a little girl in the neighborhood, and he built blocks for her so that she could position her feet like that, so that he had a model to paint her. The painting depicts that little girl flanked by the white federal marshals walking to school past a wall defaced by racial graffiti. Barack Obama brought this into the White House and hung it up in 2011 when he invited Ruby Bridges, who was a little girl, to the White House. It was originally published in the 1964 issue of Look. It was one of many paintings that he did towards the end of his career on social commentary, on racism, on poverty, and on the challenges we then faced as a society versus the elm branch trees that he painted for the Saturday Evening Post. He was kind of sidelined as a painter in 1972, and it was just a few years before he died. After 72, he never really painted any more great paintings at all. And part of it was because he developed dementia. He had memory loss towards the end of his life, and he died at the age of 84. But I think, for me, I love his work. I love this view he had of a world maybe that didn't exist in America, but maybe we could all aspire to. So maybe a lot of lives aspired to these images that graced all these homes with these pictures and kind of brought a joy to them. But then at the end of his life, I think he also wanted to say there's more to me. And I need to make a statement also about this other part of our life. Well, is what we see in this particular painting. So it's kind of important for me to also bring this other painting to you, along with the beauty that and the impression of America that Norman Rockwell gave us in his early paintings. But again, this painting that we saw before, Saying Grace, sold for $46 million to an undisclosed buyer, and that is a significant amount of money for a painting, let alone a Norman Rockwell painting. Do you have any thoughts about these two paintings as we've looked at them?
This one brings tears to my eyes because it seems as if we've somewhat gone backwards from when this painting was done as of today.
1964.
Mhm.
Isn't that
Hasn't
something?
changed a whole lot.
Mhm.
Isn't that something?
Very sad.
Mhm.
But maybe this time, hopeful.
I was going to say he's kind of, to me, an uber realist in what he paints. I mean, there is so much minute detail. I mean, the cracks on the wall, the tomatoes, the splash, everything. There's so much detail in this, and yet, as you say, this was his imagination. It was not necessarily, something that he witnessed personally, but yes, he did, and. It's just incredible. His work is just incredible. I've always liked his work, always. Beautiful. This is so poignant and so, today, such a telling portrait right here.
It is. If you do any art and you see something like this, you think, how does someone capture all the nuances in the color,
Yes.
create the depth? But more importantly, as Spielberg said, and when you look at this one, what did I say that Spielberg said again here? That he
created a story, the whole
Yes.
story.
He was always on my mind because I had a great deal of respect for how he could tell stories in a single frozen image, the entire story.
Yeah.
He did, didn't he?
Yeah. Did he paint in acrylic or oil?
Oil on canvas. And this particular painting, I guess I didn't write down what the size of this painting is, but they were, they hung on walls in offices and buildings and homes. So they weren't gigantic. They were probably 24 by 36, 36 by 36, something like that. So, my friends, that concludes the last of our series. We ended with Norman Rockwell, and I hope you enjoyed it.
It was fantastic. Can we do it again?
Yeah.
Yeah. More.
More.
Thank you so much, Kathy. It was great.
It's interesting to learn about a painting. We look at them, but there's stories in them, and the art had a message.
The poetry, I mean, very poetic. The description of Rockwell's work, a whole thing in one single image is extremely poetic.
Extremely, right. And it's really quite a skill as a craftsperson, and that was one of the reasons why in the 1950s, Norman Rockwell's work was maligned, because we gave up craftsmanship at that time too. So when you are a craftsperson, regardless if you are a baker or a carpenter or a painter or a bricklayer, if you are good at your job, it tells a story. There's just some beauty to it. And when an artist, and I said very early, it was one of my early phrases, does not have to be a perfectionist, but has to be convincing.
Uh-huh.
And these artists are very convincing in the story they tell. And many of them were mavericks. I want to tell, I have something inside I want to get out. But they were also very disciplined, and they were skilled at their craft. They spent hours learning, copying the masters, learning composition, learning how to tell that story convincingly. And that's the craft of a craftsperson, regardless of what the craft is. So,
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank
wow.
you.
Thank you.
for joining.
Really
Bye-bye.
wonderful. Thank you.
I absolutely